Welcome back, Wanderers! Amazon has released a new trailer of the Rings of Power series, so go check that out if you haven't already. Keep an eye out for a bonus episode where I'll give you my breakdown of what's happening in that trailer. And by the way, if you are not currently an Amazon Prime subscriber, use the links in the show notes for every episode to try either a free trial to Amazon Prime Video or a 50% discount on all of Amazon Prime's services. For today, welcome to the Second Age of Middle-earth. The Second Age will see the rise of Morgoth's servant Sauron, the creation of the Rings of Power, and the rise and fall of the Kingdom of Númenor. Spoiler alert. I know I said last time that we would cover the last chapter of the Silmarillion, and we did, but tacked on to the end of the main book and before the lineage charts and index are actually two more titled stories in the published Silmarillion. So today's episode is a breakdown of the first part of a tale called Akalabaith, or The Downfall of Númenor, in a book called The Silmarillion, written by JRR Tolkien and published in 1977 after his death. A link to purchase the Silmarillion is in the show notes. Welcome! In the Lord of the Rings podcast, we wander the world of J.R.R. Tolkien by exploring the foundational epic stories from the deep past of Middle-earth. If you enjoyed Tolkien's books, or maybe Peter Jackson's movies, or perhaps you're excited for Amazon Studios' new series, The Rings of Power, and you want to dive deeper into the rich world of Middle-earth, then listen and subscribe. Magovanyan, fellow wanderers. Today's episode date is July 14th. We are 50 days away from the debut of Amazon's Rings of Power series. On this day in Middle-earth, in the year 2941, Bilbo and the dwarves are riding into the mountains, and Bilbo is thinking about all the great summer activities that are happening in the Shire. And in the year 3018, Gandalf is a prisoner in the Great Tower Orthanc, and Frodo is making plans to leave Hobbiton. This is adapted from the Today in Middle-earth History calendar on the OneRing.net. Let's check the map. These map checks are inspired by the beautiful maps that accompany the Lord of the Rings books, and I hope give you the context for today's story. If none of this makes sense, please listen to a few previous episodes and catch back up. The first age of Middle-earth ended with the forces of the Valar subduing the Dark Lord Morgoth, reclaiming the Silmarils, and expelling Morgoth into the Timeless Void. So it is now the second age of Middle-earth. A lot of things happen in the second age, but here's the problem. It's all spread out in a lot of different places, and you kind of have to piece the puzzle together. So that's what I'll attempt to do today. Some of these puzzle pieces include the Akalabaith in the Silmarillion, which I mentioned earlier. You should read it if you haven't already, because I'll draw heavily from that source. I will also draw from the Return of the King Appendix A, which has a good high-level summary of the first and second ages. Also in the Return of the King in Appendix B is a section called Tale of Years. This is basically a chart of major events during the Second Age, and will be a useful guidepost as we go along. Christopher Tolkien's book, titled Unfinished Tales, also has a deeper lore of the Second Age and Númenor, and maybe I'll mix some of those details in as well. Also, Karl Hostetter has further published various manuscripts by Tolkien regarding the Kingdom of Númenor in his book, The Nature of Middle-earth. If you'd like to purchase any of these books, you can find a link in the show notes. And lastly, coming out in November is a new book called The Fall of Númenor, which is a compilation of all things Second Age, so stay tuned for news on that new edition. Okay, boring stuff out of the way. Let's get to Númenor. The story of Númenor begins with Elros, one of the sons of Eärendil and Elwing, and the brother to Elrond. Because of the voyage of Eärendil and Elwing, Elros and Elrond were able to choose which of their lineages they would be counted with, either the Elves or men. Elrond chose to be counted with the Elves, and Elros chose to be counted among men. After the Great Battle, which ended the First Age of Middle-earth, the evil men who had followed Morgoth and yet survived fled into the west, and became wicked kings over the, quote, wild and lawless men that had remained behind. Elros and the faithful men who had fought for the Valar did not return to the east. For their faithfulness to the elves, the men were given a new land. Quote, a land was made for the Edain to dwell in, neither part of Middle-earth nor of Valinor. This land was an island that was raised from the depths of the sea and was situated about halfway between Middle-earth and the Undying Lands in the west, although it was slightly closer to the west. Some of the powers that govern the world, the Valar, themselves created this land. Aule, the craftsman, established it. Yavanna, responsible for plant life, enriched it. And the elves brought many flowers from their own island of Tol Eressëa. When 32 years had passed, the island was finally ready, and the Edain sailed there, led by Eärendil's star, and assisted by the shipbuilding elves. Sailing to the west, they see the land, quote, shimmering in a golden haze, and find the country to be, quote, fair and fruitful. They give it a new name in the High Elvish tongue, Númenor, or Westernesse. Elros was appointed by the Valar to be the first king of this people, and thus the kingdom of Númenor was established. And, quote, this was the beginning of that people that in the Grey Elven speech are called the Dunedain, the Númenorians, kings among men. There's the first use of the word Dunedain to describe the people of Númenor. Though this is the beginning, most people are more familiar with the last remnants of the Dunedain, more commonly known as Rangers, in the lands about the Shire in the Third Age, of whom Aragorn is a member. Not only were the Númenóreans blessed with a new, divinely given land, but they were also blessed with long life, quote, many times that of lesser men, as Appendix A points out. They weren't troubled by sickness either, and though they could not, quote, escape from the doom of death that Ilúvatar had set upon all mankind, in Númenor they lived a blissful and peaceful life, much like the Elves and Valar in Valinor. Elros, for his part, was a descendant of all three houses of faithful men, as well as the Elves, and as well as the Maiar, through Luthien, whose mother was Melian of Doriath. Elros's blessing of long life was 500 years. The blessing of long life is a major theme you'll want to watch for as you wander through the Akallabeth. Or, to articulate this theme in its opposite, watch for the different attitudes and feelings that the Númenóreans have towards death. Okay, let's describe this island in a bit more detail. Númenor was raised out of the sea and was roughly shaped like a five-pointed star, which adds another layer of meaning to Huor's prophecy about a new star rising that we covered in episode 32. The chief city and port was established in the west because it faced the sunset, and thus the Undying Lands, but the royal capital was established in a more central city. This city was at the foot of a great mountain, quote, tall and steep, that stood a touch off-center of the star-shaped island. This mountain was called Meneltarma, or Pillar of Heaven. I'm going to switch resources here and share some details about the Meneltarma that are described in Unfinished Tales. First, the Meneltarma was, quote, sacred to the worship of Eru Ilúvatar. Yes, the Númenóreans practiced a religion. I want to share an oft-quoted but misinterpreted line from one of Tolkien's letters, quote, the Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, cults, or practices in the imaginary world, for the religious element is absorbed into the story and symbolism. Tolkien seems to have left an exception to his cutting out of religious practices when describing the Meneltarma on Númenor, for this mountain was dedicated to the creator of the world, and the one being more powerful than even the Valar, Eru Ilúvatar, for it was he who brought them into existence. Númenor seems to be the one place where a worship of Ilúvatar was mandated and followed, at least for a time. The worship of Ilúvatar was conducted through offerings and prayers that were offered at the top of Meneltarma. The top of Meneltarma was flat and wide enough that a great multitude could stand there. No structure was ever raised there, and it was forbidden for anyone to even utter a word at the top, except the king at 3 specific points in the year. At these times, the king would lead the people, clad in white, up the mountain by a spiraling road that wound around the slopes. At the top, the king would offer one of 3 prayers. In the spring, he would offer the Eru Kerme, a prayer for the coming year. In the summer, he would offer the Eru Latalie, a prayer of praise for Ilúvatar. And at the end of autumn, he would offer the Eru Hantale, a prayer of thanksgiving. Anyone was free to climb to the top of the mountain on their own in between these times of prayer. But at the top, the silence was so heavy that even a stranger who did not know the customs would be silent. When someone did come to the top, 3 eagles would perch themselves on the rocks on the west end of the summit. During the times of the 3 prayers, they would hover in the sky. Quote, they were called the Witnesses of Manwë, the king of the Valar, and they were believed to be sent by him to keep watch upon the holy mountain. There's more that could be said about Tolkien's statement that The Lord of the Rings is fundamentally a religious work, but I hope this description of Meneltarma demonstrates that Tolkien wasn't shy about the religion that was meant to be practiced in Númenor. We're not done yet. If you like this episode, please leave a review and share with your friends. And remember to subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be right back.
Do you ever find yourself thinking about who would win in a fight between Goku and Superman? Hi, I'm James Gavsey, and on the Who Would Win show, me and my co-host Ray ignore anything important happening in the outside world and debate fictional battles between characters from comics, movies, and video games.
We got a new show every week, and almost always am I the winner.
Yeah, not true, Ray.
In the past, we've discussed such matches as Captain America versus Darth Vader, Solid Snake versus the Iron Giant, classic matchups like RoboCop versus Terminator, and even the Muppets versus Sesame Street.
That one was crazy. So if you're a fan of geek culture and love a spirited debate, check out the Who Would Win show wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out at whowouldwinshow.com.
The kingdom and its inhabitants enjoyed the protection of the Valar and the friendship of the Elves. Because of that friendship, they, quote, increased in stature, both of mind and body. They had their own language, but used the High Elvish to preserve their stories, songs, and records. and the royalty also took names in High Elvish, a practice that even continued with Aragorn in the Third Age, his High Elvish name being Elisar, which I covered extensively, also in episode 32. They became great craftsmen, and being, quote, men of peace, they turned their creative efforts to the art that they loved above all others, the building of ships and sailing the open seas. But on the sailing, the Valar placed a ban. Being mortal men, the Númenóreans could not sail so far west that Númenor could not be seen. Quote, and for long the Dunedain were content, though they did not fully understand the purpose of this ban. Manwë, the king of the Valar, intended for the ban to quell any temptation that mortal men may have to seek for the undying lands, and become, quote, enamored of the immortality of the Valar and the Eldar, and the lands where all things endure. For in the Second Age, the undying lands were permitted to endure as, quote, a memorial of that which might have been, if Morgoth had not cast his shadow on the world. So here is a tension on the theme of death that I mentioned earlier. Men are mortal and must pass on. Therefore, they are not allowed to sail west, where immortal beings dwelt and endured. The men of Númenor obeyed the ban, and the far-sighted among them could see, far off in the west, a white city with a great harbor and tower. This white city, however, was not the Blessed Realm, but was the island Tol Eressëa, where the Elves dwelt, and was the easternmost landmass of the Undying Lands. These Elves brought many gifts to Númenor, but perhaps the greatest was a seedling of a white tree, which the Númenóreans planted and named Nimloth. This tree of Númenor, Nimloth, gets a mention in The Return of the King, in the chapter called The Steward and the King, and while the scene isn't in Peter Jackson's adaptation, I think the essence of its message is. The scene takes place after the crowning of Aragorn. Gandalf takes Aragorn high into the mountains above Minas Tirith. There Aragorn finds a sapling tree, which Gandalf then describes as, quote, this is a sapling of the line of Nimloth, the fair, and that was a seedling of Galthilion, and that a fruit of Telperion, eldest of trees. Here it has lain hidden on the mountain, even as the race of Elendil lay hidden in the wastes of the north. Yet the line of Nimloth is older far than your line, King Elisar. So the silver tree Telperion, which Yavanna the Vala caused to grow before the beginning of time, had a descendant in the tree of Nimloth of Númenor, which in turn gave rise to the white tree in Gondor. Aragorn's symbol on his armor is a white or silver tree, and even the tree itself, in both the books and movies, is a symbol of the reign of the king and his line. For more on the eldest of trees, Telperion, go back and listen to episode 2. Because the Númenóreans could not sail west, they went north, south, and east. In time, they landed back in Middle-earth, and while at first they made no permanent harbors or dwellings, they instead were teachers to the wild men they found living there. These wild men revered the tall sea kings, even considering them as gods. But eventually the Númenóreans, quote, began to hunger for the undying city that they saw from afar, and the desire of everlasting life to escape death grew strong upon them. While their glory and power grew, the Númenóreans could not outlast death, and so the shadow of Morgoth began to creep into their hearts. At first they murmured, only, quote, in their hearts, and then in open words, against the doom of men being death, and against the ban to sail west. Many began to argue that men should sail west, and meet with their elven friends in their own home, but the Valar sent messengers to Númenor, trying to dissuade them from carrying out their wish. Of the many things these messengers say, they try to teach that death, quote, was not at first appointed for a punishment, and, quote, this we hold to be true, that your home is not here, and the doom of men, that they should depart, was at first a gift of Ilúvatar. It became a grief to them, only because coming under the shadow of Morgoth, it seemed to them. This exchange happened 2,000 years after Númenor was established, and in the days of the 13th king of Númenor, descended from Elros. This king and his son desired to increase the wealth and might of Númenor, and they switched from providing teaching to the men of Middle-earth to extracting tribute from them. Now, this king did something really intriguing that hadn't happened before in Númenor. The tradition for royal succession, which started from Elros, was for the king to willingly hand his scepter to his son, and then sometime later, willingly and peacefully leave life. For a great example of this, check out Appendix A in Return of the King, at the end of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, where Aragorn says to Arwen, after many years of ruling, quote, to me has been given not only a span thrice that of men of Middle-earth, but also the grace to go at my will, and give back the gift. Now therefore I will sleep. However, the 13th king of Númenor was having none of that. He became the first Númenorian to, quote, cling to his life beyond the end of all joy. He refused to depart, and denied his son the kingship. So the people became divided. On the one hand, you have the king's men, who had become proud and jealous of the immortal elves, and desired to stave off death and become immortal, while on the other hand were the faithful or elf friends, who desired to keep their friendship with the elves, but even they were, quote, troubled by the thought of death. As time passed, quote, the fear of death grew darker upon the Númenóreans, and they delayed it as long as they could, and built great houses for the dead. In their efforts to prolong life, they were successful only in, quote, the art of preserving incorrupt the dead flesh of men. Indeed, there's a passage in the Two Towers, when Faramir is explaining the history of Gondor to Frodo and Sam, he even lays the blame of Númenor's downfall to the fear of death. In part, he says, quote, death was ever present, because the Númenóreans still, as they had in their old kingdom, and so lost it, hungered after endless life unchanging. Kings made tombs more splendid than houses of the living, and counted old names in the rolls of their descent dearer than the names of their sons. Childless lords sat in aged halls musing on heraldry. In secret chambers, withered men compounded strong elixirs, or in high cold towers asked questions of the stars. It wasn't long before the Númenóreans neglected to offer their first fruits and prayers to Ilúvatar, and seldom did anyone go to the top of Middle-Tarma. Instead, they fortified their strongholds in Middle-earth, making the harbor stronger and the towers taller. But the faithful continued to converse with the elves, especially with Gil-galad, king of the Noldor, in the north of Middle-earth. They made a haven at the mouths of Anduin, the great river that the Fellowship took boats down. This haven they called Peligir, which is the same harbor where Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, with help from the shadow host of the dead, would drive back the navy of the Haradrim and commandeer their ships to sail forth to Minas Tirith. The faithful also sent military aid to Gil-galad, when, in the Second Age, a dark foe had arisen in the east, Sauron, the servant of Morgoth. We'll discuss Sauron's hatred of the Númenóreans next time. My friends, if you enjoyed this episode, let me know by subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing with your friends. Follow me on Facebook or Instagram at Lore of the Rings Podcast. For feedback on the show, please email me using the link in the show notes. Until next Thursday, remember, not all those who wander are lost.